All right, so we're in Acts chapter 21, and I'm looking at the questions. I know it's on the back part of this. So we're talking about the Nazarite law, and evidently, it's now I say evidently, there's no evidence in the description in the chapter that this is the Levirate law, but there is some matter of purification. So whatever that is, we're not exactly sure. And we talked about this last week or last time, whenever it was. And one of the problems we run into is people might start making assumptions. And if we're not careful, we'll make some assumptions just like they made assumptions about Paul in the temple when they at one point saw him with Gentiles, and then they saw him in the temple and they just assumed that the Gentiles were with him. We can make assumptions too. So that's something we want to avoid. It doesn't say that it was the Nazarite law. That's the common assumption, because the Nazarite law was supposed to be fulfilled and the sacrifices made for it at the temple. And so that's where a lot of commentators that I've read said that. But unless I missed it, it's not in here saying that it was. But he was urged to make peace. And so this is the spirit in which he's doing this. He's trying to help keep keep everything calm, right? And not cause a riot, not cause problems. And it says in verse 24, take them and be purified with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. All right, so we talked about that as well. What does it mean then in this context to walk orderly and keep the law? Did they intend for Paul to keep the law of Moses, and did they think that he did? What do you think? Well, these people that are talking to him are Christians, and they're the elders of the church. There was a bit of confusion, if you remember, in the first century. It took them a while to figure this out, where the line was and how much they had to be, as Jews, how much they had to still continue to follow the law of Moses compared to the Gentiles. So there was some of that discussion. But also there were traditions and customs that were carried over there was nothing technically wrong with them. One thing is for sure, we can't really look at this and say, well, Paul just didn't know any better, because he actually has already probably written the book of Romans, probably has already written First Thessalonians and Galatians probably was his first book. It's either that or First Thessalonians. It's kind of up in the air. But both of those books would not condone the idea of Paul just going along with the Jewish system of the religious system. He would have to stand against it, and this would be so that makes it an important discussion. And so we have to keep in mind that, and also keep in mind that there was a struggle, and part of the issue is not related to the religious system, but the political system, right? So, but there's politics involved, and the politics get murky, as they often do, because there's certain laws of Moses that was attached to the customs, and so it's one of those things where it's like where you can present yourself to do certain things, but you don't necessarily mean it the same way that they intend for you to mean it. So keeping the Sabbath, for example, if they slept in on Saturday and took the day off, did that mean that they were necessarily trying to follow the law of Moses? And I think we'd have to say no, right? So that's the same thing with us. So if you take off on Saturday and you rest, that doesn't mean that you're following the law of Moses. And if you don't rest on Saturday, it doesn't mean that you're violating the Sabbath, because the Sabbath doesn't apply to you. That's kind of the same ideas that we're looking at with Paul and his associates, I think. Anyone have any comment about that? This is the time when you speak in class when everyone can actually hear what you're saying. So this would be a good thing to do if you want to speak up.
And I'm not really sure what to add to it. I mean, from this, just the raw text itself, the law, I mean, generally, I mean, known as, Paul being often referring to it as mainly the keystone part of it being the 10 Commandments. I mean, like you said, that one exception there with the Sabbath, otherwise, I don't know. I don't really have much to say.
So how much of the law? Go ahead.
Following precepts of the law of Moses is one thing, but you're not relying on it for salvation.
Okay.
Yeah, that's true.
I think that's key. It has to do with why you're doing it. For example, when Paul had Timothy circumcised, was it so that Paul didn't do that thinking that Timothy was going to be saved by that? But before he was a Christian, he would have said, hey, you have to be circumcised on the 8th day or you're going to be cut off from the people, right? So there had to be a shift in the thinking. And that has to be some of what they meant by that, but it's hard to know exactly, where they were, what they understood at that point. There's no doubt in my mind, the apostles understood to a degree, and Paul very much so, but the leaders of the church may not have fully understood it. One of the reasons for that is because we generally don't learn things until we're forced to. Have you noticed that? So Paul was forced to grapple with this problem because he was in the Gentile world all the time. And the religious leaders, the elders in Jerusalem, they didn't hardly have anyone there that would have been Gentiles. More than likely, they were almost all Jews, if there were any Gentiles there at all. So there is a difference in what's being said. And we have to give leeway. We have to give understanding for people trying to figure things out, I suppose. Oh, but anyway, Paul took them in verse 26, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. So he was purified along with them. The purification, the offering that would be made would be for the people who actually went through the whatever it was that they were going through. Let's see here. The verse 23 says that they had taken a vow. So they were the ones who had taken the vow, and they would have to be the ones that were making an offering for them. Paul wouldn't have had to, but that doesn't really let him off the hook if he's actually supporting that and paying for it to be done, that kind of thing. So, the easy answer, and like I said, we can spend a lot of time on this. The easy answer is to say there's just not enough information to know. There's not, in some ways, everything that I've come up with as explanation, none of it really was adequate for me. I think there are problems with a lot of ways, and so there's something going on that we just don't understand, or we have the wrong concept of it or something. But it is interesting that it's in there, and he wasn't trying to hide anything. So it says, when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled his holy place." So here's exaggeration and then lies on top of it. In what way, how would Paul actually ever have taught against the Jewish people or the law? Has he done that in any sense?
You could say maybe on one hand, but otherwise, no, since Christ was the fulfillment of the law, which he's written about. So
Yeah. So what he would have said against the law would have been, this is not the law you're supposed to follow anymore. I mean, that definitely would have been speaking against the law.
Yeah.
But not in the same way they understand it.
Absolutely.
And this place, how would he have spoken against Jerusalem or the temple? That's a little bit more going back to some of the things Jesus said.
I was going to
Well,
say.
the temple is not a physical temple anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not a physical temple. Yeah. What was the accusation that they made against Jesus related to the temple? Do you remember?
He's going to destroy it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's going to destroy the temple.
Right. You destroy it and
Rebuild it in
he'll
3 days.
rebuild it again in 3 days. And of course, he was talking about his body, but did he speak out against and say that the temple was going to be destroyed?
Not one stone shall be left upon another.
Yeah, he did. He very much spoke against the temple in that sense. And that would have been probably some of the things that Paul would have taught as well, because he was told by Jesus to go tell everything that he had been taught. So that could have been some of the accusation that's coming up. And then the accusation that he brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled his holy place. It says, for they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And that was just completely a false accusation. But it was just kind of one, we kind of, when we're making a list of things against someone, we tend to throw everything that we can on it. And then we start, making up things also to make sure that people see how really bad this person is. And that's exactly what's going on. It says all the city was disturbed and the people ran together and seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple. And immediately the doors were shut. So they drug him out of the temple at that point. That's a pretty serious thing. That would have been not in the directly inside the temple. We're talking about the walls around the temple that were the Jewish people could go into. But why do you suppose that this is a really minor thing, but why do you suppose they shut the doors?
I guess to keep him out. I don't see why I wouldn't have gone back in otherwise.
Well, yeah. Somebody said that they shut it for business. They shut it down because just in case blood was shed, none would get into the temple area and defile it. And they said that was kind of a common practice. I don't know if that's true, but it is interesting that they shut the door. So they kicked him out and they shut the doors. They slammed the door on him, and he can't have any access to it anymore. And they're not going to let him have access to it anyway because of the uproar of the crowd. And then verse 31 says, as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. So the garrison, I wish I could draw you a picture, but if you think about the walls of the city and the inside is the temple, along the outside of the temple walls, that's where the garrison commander was. And so he was pretty close already, as I understand it. And I'm going by a map in my head that I can remember seeing. But he was pretty close. And so whenever he heard word, he immediately jumped into the situation. In verse 32, he took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. So he stepped in at just the right time because they were already beating him. The intention was to kill him. That's how furious they were with him. And remember that there are possibly Christians involved in this too. It doesn't say, but a lot of Christians were there. And so there's a lot of confusion. I'm not exactly sure, I'm not trying to say that Christians were doing something wrong, but it's a possibility anyway. And there's so many people there because of the feast and all that. So the commander came near and took him, and the commander commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and he asked who he was and what he had done. So the 2 chains would have been one for his feet and one for his hands. And then they asked him what he'd done. They chained him up because, to appease the crowd, right? And some of the multitude cried one thing and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. And when he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him." And Paul was about to be led into the barracks. He said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" He replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" And Paul said, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus and Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." Okay, so the arrest for Paul was for what purpose? Why was he arrested?
Causing an uproar in the city.
Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
Oh no, I just said that's pretty much what James said. Disturbing the peace.
Disturbing the peace. Yeah, it could be because they were beating him and he wanted to figure out what's going on. So he stepped in to diffuse the situation. In a sense, it's for his own good, but the who actually had the right of capital punishment, putting them to death?
The Romans.
The Romans did. Yeah. The Jewish people didn't have the right to, unless things have changed. But at this point, from the Jesus's day, they couldn't just take him out and kill him. They did it with Stephen, but now they're about to do it to this man. And so he's going to step in. He doesn't want that to happen until he figures out what's going on. And remember, I've said many times, the Romans were, they really reinforced the peace idea that you didn't cause problems. So they're going to come in and fix this. And there were a lot of them that came in, evidently, because there's a lot of people involved. And so he asked them to speak. And then he thought that Paul was the commander of an Egyptian, verse 38, which is kind of funny. It's kind of out of nowhere. It's like, "Oh, aren't you that Egyptian?" He just made the assumption. He had no idea what's going on. But he supposedly led a rebellion and led 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness. And I could just imagine the look on Paul's face of like, "What in the world are you talking about?" He says, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia. And he said, "I just want to speak to my people," right? So, Carly, did you say something? Oh, you lit up. I thought you said
Nope.
something.
Oh,
Okay.
nope, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So he asked then for permission, and when he had given him permission in verse 40, Paul stood up on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people. And when there's a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language. Okay. So last question of the chapter is, why do you think he would speak to them in Hebrew?
Be a little bit more,
Listen to
a little bit more intimate, a little bit more personal.
Yeah, a little more personal. They would listen to him. And it kind of surprised them a little bit, as we'll see here. They kind of kept quieter. And that, incidentally, what language did the people speak? I mean, Hebrew is involved, but was that the common language of the times?
Greek was the common language, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
From what I understand, everyone spoke Greek in the households, but in times of worship, they would, especially in the temple, they would use Hebrew. So everyone was fluent in Hebrew, but they most of their interactions, especially in business, when they went to work, they spoke Greek, and when they're at home and they're at the temple, they spoke Hebrew. So this is part of the reason why I did that. And also it's probably because of if it's your heart language, right, as you call it, this is your language. Like English is our language. Even if you learned another language and was extremely fluent in it, you still would English would still be your heart language. It'd still be the language that you would use and turn to most times. I never thought about it before, but when people pray in another language, they often will pray in English in their home language in their head, and they have to translate it into a prayer in public for other people to hear. And that's one of the reasons that it's really difficult for some people who have transitioned to another language. It's really difficult for them to lead prayers because it's such an intimate thing that they don't think of it in another language. They think of it in their own language. But anyway, that's kind of an interesting point. All right, any comments or questions? All right, I'm gonna keep an eye on the time because we don't have a bell. So this is the next chapter. There are just a few questions about this, and we'll go through it pretty quick. So chapter 22, this is what Paul is saying to them. Brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now. And when they heard that he spoke to them in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent. He said, I'm indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's zeal, our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you all are this today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prisons both men and women, as also the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders, from whom I also received letters to the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring in chains even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished. All right, so this is what he's starting to retell his story, right, of what happened to him. What are his tactics here so far? What's he trying to do? But especially verses 3-5 talk about where he was born and how he was raised, that kind of thing. Why is he saying that, do you think?
He's showing that he's zealous for God's word.
Okay. He's showing he's zealous.
And it brings, it brings to light, the credentials in which he has to speak on this very subject.
Also relating to them.
Yeah, that's right. He has credentials for it because of the training that he grew up. Doesn't it also put him in the same boat with them? Doesn't it make a connection with them? Because listen, I understand where you're coming from. This is where I was too, right?
It's kind of showing his pedigree.
Yeah, showing his pedigree. I think that's important.
Right.
But what I think probably what he's trying to do also is, like I said, he's trying to get people to see that they're zealous. He was exactly the same way as they were. See, he's making a connection with that. That's why he spoke in Hebrew. He's making a connection. And that's an important idea. Now, the pedigree gives him authority, lets them, trust him a little bit with it, because this man grew up under the feet of Gamaliel. Do you think it actually, at this point in Paul's life, do you think that that's something that he holds in high regard necessarily at this point?
Well, probably not. But at least it does give him some basis, depending on what was taught by Gamaliel and the specific details that, if the teaching was right, of course, I guess that's the question. What's in question is that, that Christ would come. Well, Paul finally did see that, as we know. Yeah,
that's right. In fact, he said, speaking of his heritage and how he'd been raised, he said he just counted all as rubbish. It doesn't mean that it wasn't valuable, but that's not something that he held in high regard anymore. But he wanted them to understand it, that this is where he came from.
Right.
So he's, anytime you have a dispute, you start with common ground. And when you're giving your defense, you start with common ground, because that helps to lay the foundation to build on. And it's just like learning something. You introduce new information based on things that you already know. And when you're defending yourself like this, so if you're ever caught up in a crowd like this and you're going to be on trial for your life, start with creating a foundation of commonality so that they can understand you better, and remind them who you are as a human being, one of their brethren. He calls them in verse 1, brethren and fathers, terms of respect. So anyway, let's see here. In verse 6, it happened as I journeyed and came near Damascus at about noon, suddenly a great light from heaven shone around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you're persecuting. And those who were with me indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they did not hear the voice of him who spoke to me. So I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, arise and go into Damascus, and there you be told all things which are appointed for you to do. And since I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of those who were with me, I came into Damascus. Then a certain Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good testimony with all the Jews who dwelt there, came to me, and he stood and said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that same hour, I looked up at him. Okay, so we've heard this story already twice. Once. He's going to say it again later. Acts chapter 9 had this before. What was it that, let's see here. Looking at verse 10, when he says, what shall I do, Lord? He said, arise and go into Damascus. You'll be told what to do. What were the things that Paul was told to do whenever he went into town?
Arise and be baptized, washing away the sins, calling on the name of the Lord.
Yeah.
Yep. That was part of it. That was the beginning. What else was he taught? Was he told? Some of it's going to be what we haven't read yet, but verse 14 says, then he said, the God of our fathers has chosen you that you should know his will and see the just one and hear the voice of his mouth. All right. But there's nothing saying at this point, he's not saying all the things that we've already heard about that was going to happen. Do you remember what the other things was going to happen that he was called to do?
He's going to be teaching the Gentiles.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, they're spokesman.
He was going to go out to the Gentile nations. He would speak before kings. And there was quite a bit more that was said about that. So he's keeping that quiet now, but he's actually building up to it. And so it says in verse 15, for you will be his witness to all men of what you have seen and heard. So he's already talking about this is why he's doing what he's doing. Notice what he said also. How did he describe Ananias?
Devout man according to the law, having a good report with all the Jews.
Right. So the beginning of his ministry was sanctioned by this man who was a devout Jew, had a great testimony with all the Jews who dwelt there. So that he's giving credibility again for what he said, what he was doing. And he told him to receive his sight in verse 13. That same hour, I looked up at him. And let's see here. In verse 14, the God of our fathers has chosen you that you should know his will and see the just one and hear the voice of his mouth. Okay, so that he's determined that he's going to be an apostle, basically. And he said he was an apostle from birth, basically. For you will be his witness to all men of what you have seen and heard. And now what are you waiting? Why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. That's an interesting phraseology that if you are interested in studying Greek, take a look at that verse and see what Ananias commanded him and the tenses and things. I'm not going to go into it now because I don't want to distract. It's not important for the class, but it is interesting if you're interested in looking at that kind of stuff. There's some things I didn't realize or recognize about that, but it's essentially saying what this says. I'm not saying there's a problem with the translation. It just reinforces it very well. And according to Acts chapter 9, verses 9 through 11, it says that Paul was fasting and praying there for 3 days. And that when God came to Ananias, he said, go to this man because he's there praying. All right. Well, we've talked about this, especially when we talked about in chapter 9, we're talking about this. And we're saying, what do you suppose he was praying about? So we're talking about, obviously, he recognizes now he's caught up in sin, that he thought he was doing good, but now he's realized he's actually persecuting the people who belong to the Son of God. And that was a bad thing for him to do. And now he recognizes all this sin in his life. So he's obviously praying for forgiveness. He's praying for, redemption, praying for God to help him through this situation. And if you notice what it says in verse 16, What is the difference between praying for forgiveness, which I'm assuming he did when it described that in Acts 9, and calling on the name of the Lord for forgiveness? Does it indicate that there's a difference between the two?
Well, I mean, in this particular context, it seems to be preceded by the condition as part of what's referenced there. Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling upon the name of the Lord. I mean, it's almost like they're almost synonymous.
Yes. Yeah. So I would, in having discussions with people, I always try to bring this out, is that here in this context, calling on the name of the Lord is a phrase is used in several different ways. One, sometimes it could be said to be used of prayer. Other times it could be a reference to God's people, just those people who call on the name of the Lord. And in other ways, it's used for worship in general. And in this context, it's actually referring to calling on the name of the Lord is a reference to what's happening at baptism, right?
Yeah, it follows. I mean, yeah, I was gonna mention it follows as a result of. So as you're reading it, arise and be baptized, wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. I mean, you can see
Yes.
right there, it follows as a result.
Right. So the calling on the name of the Lord in this context is not a vocal calling out. It's an activity. In the baptism is the calling out. So when you're baptized and have your sins washed away, that happens because when you're baptized, you're calling out to God. Peter says that baptism is it's a request or a plea to God for a good conscience. And that's the English Standard Version translates that very well. But that's the idea. Baptism is a calling out to God for salvation because he's promised us that we can have our sins forgiven. So that's a very important distinction that's made. He wasn't just saying a prayer. He was actually calling upon God with activity. And that calling upon God in that activity is what he was told to do. And he was already praying to God. If God would just simply accepted his prayer, everything would have been fine because he'd been praying for 3 days. But there was something more. He had to have this part of that. So do you think, based on verse 16, do you think that Paul believed that when he was baptized, his sins would be forgiven at that point? It seems pretty obvious, right? I mean, there's really not any other way of looking at it. He was told to do it for this specific reason. And incidentally, that's the way it is. Anytime you read in the New Testament, someone is baptized, they always understood why they were doing it. There's just no way around it. They were always told. And so anyway, I know we understand baptism, but it is good to see that now and then. And that's really good place for you to go to when you're studying with someone who doesn't really understand baptism. This is one of those highlight verses that would really be helpful. All right. So coming back to the context here in Acts chapter 22, it says in verse 17, it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I was in a trance. And I saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. And so I said, Lord, they know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believe on you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by, consenting to his death and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then he said to me, depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. All right. So that was the worst thing that he could have said, really, related to the anger of the crowd. The worst thing he could have said was, I'm going to go to the Gentiles, and not only am I going, but God is the one who told me to go. And so this is now they listened to him until this word, and they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he is not fit to live. Right. And why would they think that he's deserving of death because of this?
Well, they were God's chosen people. He was saying, basically making the Gentiles equal to them.
Yes, it was blasphemous to them.
Yeah, that last phrase he said, yeah, that's exactly what they took it as.
Right. And so he needs to be put to death. Because is there any difference between how they're feeling about him and the way he felt about other people before he was a Christian, about other Christians? He probably had the same idea. These people are deserving of death, not for the same reason, but they're here upset about the fact that he's going out to the Gentiles. But he still felt like they were deserving of death because of what they believed. It was blasphemous to them. Maybe the people in the city here have gotten used to the idea of people saying that Jesus is Lord, but they're definitely upset because he's putting the Gentiles in the same camp with the Jews. Certainly was bad. So as they cried, they tore off their clothes and threw dust in the air. And the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks and said that he should be examined under scourging so that he might know why they shouted so against him. Someone said that the commander didn't understand Paul's words. He didn't understand Hebrew. And so he's trying to figure it out. But even if he did understand, he might not have understood why it was they were so upset. Right. So he was just trying to figure it out, but they were going to scourge him over this. And it says, as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? And the centurion heard that. He went and told the commander, saying, take care what you do, for this man is a Roman. And the commander came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? He said, yes. The commander answered, with a large sum I obtained this citizenship. And Paul said, I was born a citizen. And then immediately those who were about to examine him withdrew from him. And the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman and because he had bound him. Okay, so what's going on here? I think we all understand this, but why is it significant that he was, that they discovered he's a Roman?
He
Because
wasn't a
Romans, Romans, you couldn't do anything to a Roman without proper authority, basically without the emperor's nod.
Right. They had to go through a certain process, right? You couldn't just take them and beat them, and certainly couldn't scourge them.
Yeah, he was a citizen. He had rights.
Yes.
So.
And what kind of, I don't want to get into a political situation here, but what is the view of someone who would be born into a Roman citizenship versus someone who bought their way into citizenship? How would they see that? Would there be a difference in the way they're seen, you think?
Our status.
What was that?
A higher status.
Yeah, a higher status, that they would be, they would be more highly respected, because these people didn't, I mean, they were born that way. They were, and they were like everyone else of the day. The Jews saw the Jews and the Gentiles, and the Romans saw the Romans and everyone else. And so they very much had that kind of mentality. But he now is taking a step back. And it's interesting that one of the reasons he's upset about or afraid is at the end of verse 29. He was afraid after he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. All right. That's interesting to me because of the next verse, because it says the next day, because he wanted to know for certain why he was accused by the Jews, he released him from his bonds, the commander and the chief priests and all their council to appear. And he commanded them to appear and brought Paul down and set him before them. So if he was afraid he took a step back and he was afraid because he had bound him, why didn't he let him go?
Well, just because someone says they're a Roman citizen doesn't mean they are.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point. He may have caused even more trouble. And then what if the guy was lying? Right. So that's a good point. Adam, were you going to say the same thing?
Well, I mean, it's like, yeah, I mean, he seems to be between a rock and a hard place. I mean, if he lets him go, then he's just gonna have this situation on his hands in which he'd have to give an answer for to him. Like, then just turn to him like, "Hey, what happened here?" Well,
yeah, and if he actually was a Roman citizen and he let the guy go and they killed him, he would have been, yeah, there would have been heads rolling over that one.
yeah.
So yeah, he's in a precarious situation. And from here on out, basically Paul is in prison just as protective measures. And when he gets to Rome, he's going to be in prison. It's not that I don't want to suggest that he really, they just opened the gates and let him out anytime he wanted. He actually was arrested, but it was pretty much understood that it was because of the situation, and they needed to figure out what was going on before things got out of hand too much. So that brings us to the end of the chapter 23, chapter 22, and chapter 23. This is when he's actually talking to the council because they're trying to figure out what's going on. And Paul it's brilliant the way he plays this out, and gets a free trip to Rome out of it. But is there anything related to this or anything else y'all want to talk about or questions about while we're here?